Okay, so as I go into present mode here, our next unit or subunit is going to be about the old brain, sometimes referred to as the primitive brain, the brain that we downshift into when we go into survival mode, also sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain. Regarding evolution, these parts of the brain were the first to develop, so that's why we refer to it as the old brain. Also, the reptilian brain, because we share a lot of these structures with lower forms of life. So as we go to our capital D, because capital C was nervous system, and we're just kind of rolling with this, the old brain, and we're going to work on structures here. And you may hear former AP students talk about Unit 2 as the most difficult unit. I'm not going to lie about that. It is difficult for some. It's really interesting, but there's a lot of memorization. So you really need to stay on top of this so when that test rolls around, you're ready for it. So we have 4 brain structures that are found within the brain stem itself. So we have this blue, and I don't know what color this is, kind of salmon maybe, color representing these 4. And the medulla, first of all, is our life support system. It's responsible for breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. It's the lowest of all the brain structures, really. It's here. This would be the spinal cord. So it's on top of the spinal cord or on the bottom of the brainstem, depending on how you look at it. And again, it's responsible for our life support system of breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. So if your medulla gets damaged, there's going to be death. That's why, I don't know if you've ever seen the movies, somewhere sneaks up behind somebody and does this really quick to their head. They're trying to snap their medulla and kill them. That's the whole point. All right, the pons is kind of this structure that juts out here. So we have the medulla, and then we have a bump here, and that represents the pons. And the pons regulates several functions, including hearing, our balance or equilibrium, taste, and facial movements. Okay, so I don't know if you know, Jim Carrey has a lot of facial expressions. Okay, that comes from your pons, all right? The reticular formation are actually fibers that run through the brainstem, okay? So we're going to define reticular formation as fibers inside the brainstem that are responsible for the 3 A's, really: attention, alertness, and arousal. Okay, attention, alertness, and arousal. So if someone calls your name and you look, or if a fire alarm goes off and you jump in class, or there's a really loud noise while you're sleeping and you jump out of bed, that's your reticular formation. It's causing you to attend to what's going on. Okay, so what you'll notice is a lot of these things, again, are responsible for our survival. The reticular formation does that. Okay, it tells us, be on alert, be ready. So if we hear a loud noise right behind us, we turn and look to see if it's something that's going to be, dangerous to us. And then our last brainstem structure is the midbrain. Okay, our midbrain is involved with visual tracking. All right, so my eye movements and being able to follow things in space. So our visual tracking, our motor control, also alertness, and temperature regulation. Okay, so you will see, once in a while, you will see some overlap because multiple brain structures work together on some of these things. So, if there's a question, for example, on, a brain structure that's responsible for alertness and arousal, my brain would go, that's going to be reticular formation. Okay, and I'd look in the multiple choice answers and reticular formation isn't there. I would think it's probably midbrain. If that's not there, I would think, well, then it's probably the pons. So I'd be in this area. So it's good to obviously know what they are, but you have to be flexible in your thinking to be able to adapt to questions that come about. Okay, so in the midbrain, by the way, is right in the middle of the brain. Okay, thus the term. Okay, so here's a multiple choice question. Our next part of the brain, aside from the brainstem, is called the central region, or the old brain is called the central region. There are two main parts to the central region. The first of which is called the thalamus, okay, which is kind of in this area here, okay. And the thalamus we like to refer to as our sensory switchboard or relay station. And the reason for that is that four of our five senses go to our thalamus first. And then our thalamus sends it to the part of the brain that understands that sensation, okay? So it's called the sensory switchboard or relay station. Four of our five senses go to the thalamus first, and then the thalamus routes that information to the part of the brain that can process it. So I don't know if you have ever seen, like in the way, way olden days, where when people would make phone calls and there would be a switchboard operator, and it was usually a female, so I don't mean to be gender biased, but she would take, if someone called, she would take one cord and take the call and then put it to the call that it goes to. That's kind of what the thalamus does. So when our eyes see something, the vision goes to our thalamus first, and then our thalamus routes it to the part of the brain where we process vision. I mentioned 4 out of 5, so it's important that you know this. So in parentheses, let's write all except smell, because smell is the only one that goes directly to the brain. It doesn't go to the thalamus first, okay? And then our second part of the central region is called the cerebellum. It's down here. You might remember when I told you to put your hands like this in order to make your brain, that the thumb sticking out would be the cerebellum. So your brain would be, this would be you're looking at the front part of my brain, and now you're looking at the back part, and that's the cerebellum. It's in the back, okay? And the cerebellum is sometimes referred to as the little brain, and it's responsible for balance and hand-eye coordination. So, you know, one of the things that a lot of you guys know this because you've had this experience where you get pulled over because someone thinks you're drinking and driving, and if they don't give you a blood alcohol test, what they'll do is they'll draw a line on the ground, right, and ask you to walk that straight line. And that's because if you drank enough to affect your coordination or balance, that means that alcohol got to the cerebellum, which is means you definitely are drunk. We don't need a blood alcohol test, because when you drink alcohol, it starts to affect the top part of your brain, which we're going to talk about in our next video. And that's your thinking brain, which is why alcohol makes people stupid. All right. And then as you drink more and more, it starts to go further and further down. And when it affects the cerebellum, that means the person drank a lot. You might hear people say he was stumbling down drunk or falling down drunk or things like that. That's why when a person drinks so much that alcohol can kill them, it reaches this lower part of this brainstem. Okay. So multiple choice question on this. Really the final part of this short portion is called the limbic system. And the limbic system is basically known as the emotion and memory center. And it houses 3 structures. So it's important that you know these 3 structures are part of the limbic system. You should probably know about, going back here, you should probably know the thalamus and the cerebellum are part of the central region. I would know that these are part of the brainstem, but I would definitely know that these 3 are part of the limbic system, okay? And one way I remember is just HA, H-A-H. So the hypothalamus is a really, really important structure in our brain. It does so many things. One of the things that you want to remember with the hypothalamus is the homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is a balance, right? So the hypothalamus helps us to maintain balance among many things. So when we talk about homeostasis with the hypothalamus, we're talking about homeostasis of the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus, in other words, helps us with our fight, flight, flee versus rest and digest, our parasympathetic, sympathetic, right? So the hypothalamus is really in charge of making that switch when we need to make that switch. So it is homeostasis for the autonomic nervous system. Our sleep-wake cycle is involved with our sleep-wake cycle. It's also in charge of our pituitary gland, which we'll talk about later. Also maintains homeostasis of hunger. Okay, so the hypothalamus is not going to let us starve if food's around, and it's not going to let us eat to the point where we die. Okay, if like I said, if there's food around. Same thing with thirst. All right, our hypothalamus is going to drive us to get water when we're thirsty. It's not going to allow us to drink so much water that we drown. All right. A couple other things, body temperature is responsible for that, and also our sexual motivation. Okay, one really interesting research study, not more than one, there's a lot of research studies on sexuality and the hypothalamus. And we know, for example, that heterosexual males and gay men have a different cell structure within the hypothalamus. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting byproduct of the sexual motivation portion of it. So again, the hypothalamus really, really, really popular, not popular, but important. The amygdala is where our primitive emotions of fear and anger reside. So fear and anger are the two most important emotions because they are the two emotions that help us to survive, right? So if you are looking at 100 faces in the in a game in the bleachers, for example, or in the atrium or something, and there is an angry face in those 100, you're going to lock into that angry face first. Okay, so we recognize anger, we express anger and fear through our amygdala. So we'll talk more about that in class. Okay, and then finally, the hippocampus is where our short-term and long-term memory reside. Especially basically it takes short-term memory and transfers it into long-term memory. Okay, so if someone has damaged their hippocampus, they can no longer create any new memories. So if you had hippocampus damage right now, if you had a brain aneurysm or a stroke and it damaged your hippocampus, you would still remember everything that you remembered from the past right now. Like if you know the name of your first grade teacher, you would still remember that, but you would not be able to make any new memories. Your memory might last, could last as short as 5 seconds. It can be up to a couple minutes depending on how severe the damage is. So your hippocampus takes information and then tries to get it into your long-term memory so you can hold on to it. All right, it attends to certain things. Now, it's really, really cool if you look on this here that the amygdala and the hippocampus are right next to each other, because if we ever experience anything really, really, really emotional, that triggers this memory system to lock into it. So your parents can tell you where they were when 9/11 happened. If you're a big basketball fan, you might remember where you were when you heard about Kobe Bryant's helicopter crashing. And that's because the emotion that you felt when you heard that, it almost made your hippocampus that much stronger. It gave it a jolt, and your hippocampus took that information and immediately stored it into long-term memory. This is really important, again, for survival, because if it's something that's really emotional, then I'm going to want to remember it, right? So we'll talk more about that in the memory unit. Okay, so the three structures of the limbic system are the hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. And that, I'm going to pause. Okay, actually, I'm going to end that there. So we have short videos instead of one long video in this set. So I might add a video for you in this unit, but at least they'll be shorter then.